tomorrow is the debate, right? So tomorrow morning we won't do class. You have the time to prepare. We'll come. Archana and Mark, you please just prepare in your wherever, yeah? And the rest of us will prepare over here. So whatever finalizing and fine tuning we need to do, we'll do that tomorrow morning. Okay? Yeah? Is anything not clear from last week before we move ahead, and we just move ahead a bit? Why is everyone sitting so far back? It's getting crowded all the way in the back but empty up in front. What's happened? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. Jason, are you okay? Okay. Is it clear? At least, have you started to get into the syllogism? Is that becoming more familiar? Yeah? It's more familiar, that's all we care about right now. Okay?
Maybe not with the proof, maybe not always flawless.
Yes.
But it's getting there.
It's getting there. Yeah. In fact, but that statement that you made is important, Venerable. So anyways, let's just do it here. There's proof statements, and generally this text is a little interesting because normally Tariq will begin with the reason itself, which is the proof statement, the syllogism. Here we're starting with proof statement, so it's nice. Yeah? Okay? So I'm just going to read. 304. You've heard that very standard one, which is what is that? Socrates, all men are mortal. What is that? All humans are mortal. Socrates is human, and therefore Socrates is mortal, right? That structure reflects very much the structure of proof statements, how they're worded. So it's at least familiar for you. For you who've done Tariq before, do you remember the proof statements? Do you remember it? The difference between a syllogism and a proof statement. Do you remember it? Everything that is impermanent, everything that is produced must be impermanent. For example, a pot. Do you remember that one? Yeah, everything that is produced, becoming to it, for those of you who haven't done it. Do you remember it? Everything that is produced must be impermanent. For example, a pot, even sound is produced. Or everything that is permanent must not be produced. For example, space, even however sound is. Yeah, that's what these are, okay? So this text starts like that, instead of the other one, yeah? Here, so then we're on the last paragraph. The definition of an inference for the proof of others, you remember that one? You don't have to memorize it, but that was just peculiar. Do you remember how that was peculiar? Yeah? Okay. So when it is taught that a correct proof statement must have 4 distinctive features, those 4 features are distinctive causal feature, there must be a prior valid cognition that has already realized what is to be demonstrated. 2. Distinctive feature of the subject matter, it must express its subject matter, the 3 modes of evidence, without any fault of excess or omission. Then it must have the distinctive feature of its character. It must be free from any faults of the 3, wording, factual reference and cognition. And the 4th distinctive functional feature, it must produce its effect, which is an inference. Yeah? So the prior valid cognition is of the person who is saying it. Can you imagine the setting now? So when you're debating, you are the proponent. Yes? The one who's asking. When you're answering, you are the defendant or the challenger. Okay? So you as a proponent, no, not the challenger, sorry, the challenger is the one who's asking. The challenger and the proponent are the same, the defendant and the opponent are the same. So when you're challenging, you give the proof statement. Yeah? When you give the proof statement, you must have, for it to be a valid proof statement, you must have valid cognition of what you're trying to demonstrate. Right? That's what the first part is. Yeah? Then it must express its subject matter, the three modes of correct evidence, and that is the definition of a correct reason. Something that has the three modes. And that we'll do, that's the main body of Tariq. Okay? So it has to have the three modes, which we're going to do, so don't worry about that one. It must be free from the faults of these three: wording, factual reference, and cognition. And four, it must produce its effect, which is inference. The faults in wording, factual reference, and cognition refer to the following. When a proof statement demonstrates the three modes, if the three modes are established with respect to the facts, but not established with respect to the valid cognition of a proponent and the opponent, then this is a fault of cognition. If the three modes are not established with respect to the facts, then this is a fault of factual reference. And if the three modes are expressed excessively or insufficiently, then it is a fault of wording. The Compendium of Valid Cognition. The Compendium of Valid Cognition is the text that we're going to do, the first chapter this year, and the second chapter the next year. Yeah, this is that famous Dharmakirti's Pramana Vartika, which is the Compendium of Valid Cognition. No, my mistake. This is Dignaga's Compendium of Valid Cognition. Yeah? How do they translate Pramana Vartika? What is it? Do you know? Exposition of valid cognition? Yeah. The compendium is Pramana Samuchaya, I think. Yeah? Do you know the general Pramana text, how they're divided? No, there's more. Okay, are you familiar with the general literature? Do you need like an overview? Maybe like university style overview of stuff? Does that help? Yeah. So, this has nothing to do with the text. This is for your general knowledge. Okay? The main the main Pramana text that has been written, I think, Again, we'll probably say this later also, but it's called the Compendium of Valid Cognition. Compendium, what are those clubs? Compendium means it's been collected, right? Yeah? So when it's a Compendium of Valid Cognition, Dignaga was writing many small texts and then he felt the need to combine all of them. And so the first text that came out, which is also known as the Sutra of Pramana, sometimes it's translated, is this text, the Compendium of Valid Cognition. It's translated as that. It has 3 chapters. You can find this in the intro. It has 3 chapters. One chapter is the one that talks about how you should realize phenomena. So how one realizes phenomena. Okay? And so there's a discussion of inference. How do you realize phenomena through inference? So how do you realize what in our text are hidden phenomena? Remember, there's hidden which is divided into slightly hidden and extremely hidden. So that's the first chapter. How do you recognize slightly hidden phenomena and extremely hidden phenomena? Primarily on slightly hidden phenomena. So it explains all the rules of inference, how inference works, how syllogisms work, how the conceptual mind engages in objects, because syllogisms are understood by the conceptual mind. Then the second chapter is how do you realize direct phenomena. So there's a discussion of perception, how perception works. Then the third chapter is when you have realized something, how do you make someone else realize it? So it's the tools for realizing things for oneself, and then once you have realized or once you know something, how do you then lead to someone else knowing it? That's the third chapter. So this was the main Buddhist text that was written, and this is the subject matter of that text. Yeah? Is that okay? Yeah.
What's the source, the source material of this?
Pramana Samuchaya.
Yeah.
The source material of Pramana Samuchaya is like, so it's weird because most of the other texts, they have a very clear connection to a sutra, right? Whereas the Pramana Samuchaya doesn't really have a direct connection to a sutra. It's not commenting or explaining any sutra per se. But the reason why it's not explaining any sutra, if you think about it, is because it's not giving you any content. It's explaining the means of knowledge. So that's why we classify that as epistemology, which is not knowledge. It's not telling you what you have knowledge of, but it's how do you gain understanding or knowledge of something, right? So in and of itself, it's not giving you, it's not an explanation of content, it's an explanation of the tools that you need to understand that content. So that's why it's referred to as the Pramana Sutra, because there is no sutra that speaks of Pramana per se. Yeah? Whereas if you do Madhyamaka, it refers to the Pragyaparamita Sutra. If you do Chittamatra, it refers to the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra, something like that, right? Or if you're doing Sautantrika Abhidharma, it will refer to one sutra or the other. There's no direct reference, there's no direct mention of which sutra it's coming from. And that's why it's called, in Tibetan, it's called Tsemeddo, which just means the Pramana Sutra, even though itself it's not a sutra. Yeah? And so the first teacher of Pramana is considered to be Dignaga, because he is not directly commenting on any sutra. But the material is touched upon in many sutras. So you'll have later commentators who will show you how the Buddha says something in one sutra and that Dignaga is talking about that. But Dignaga's claim was not to be talking about or explaining any one sutra per se. So he is reasoning it out mostly. It's mostly a lot of reasoning. It's not so information heavy. Yeah? At all, actually. Yeah? Yeah. Yes, actually it is. This one has been translated. Yeah, this one has been translated. So that's the main, like the source of Buddhist epistemology later on was this text. Yeah, Buddhist logic and literature, whatever you want to call it. Then the next big one was, you know that Dharmakirti, we mentioned this in passing, but just so that you get the chronology, Dharmakirti was not Dignaga's direct student. Dharmakirti was the student of Dignaga's student. Dignaga's student was Dharmottara. Then he was followed by Dharmakirti. Yeah? And so Dharmakirti is written 7, they're called 7 texts. Okay? They're called the 7 treatises on valid cognition, or 7 texts on pramana. 3 of them are called the 3 texts which are like the body, and then there's the 4 texts which are like the limbs. That's how it's explained. Yeah? The 3 texts that are like the body are called body and the other are called limb, because the 3 texts that are like the body are explaining all the content of Dignaga's text. They comment all of it. So they're complete. The subject matter is complete. And there are 3. There's an extensive one, there's a middle one, and there's a very short one. Yeah? So the extensive one, the very long one, is the one that we do, is the one that we'll be doing this year. We'll be doing a little bit of the first chapter, and then next year we'll be doing the second chapter. That's the Pramana Vartika. So the Pramana Vartika itself is a commentary in 4 chapters of Dignaga's original text, which is in 3 chapters. Okay? Yeah? Is that okay? Then there is Pramana Nishchaya, and I don't remember the third one, what is called in Sanskrit, Samarithik. And then there's the 4 limb-like texts are called the 4 limb texts because Dharmakirti felt the need to explain certain aspects of the main texts that he deemed required further explanation. So it's like clarification of important points. And if you hear what the important points are, it's very peculiar that you feel that he felt the need to explain that. For example, one of them is, in Tibetan, it's called Gyushan Drupa, which means establishing through reasoning that there are sentient beings who are not of your consciousness. They have a separate stream of consciousness, which he felt was a need to explain. Because when you talk about pramana and you're doing it, you can end up with a Chitta Matra view, with a Chitta Matra presentation, and in the Chitta Matra presentation, you're like, if everything is my mind, then you are also my mind. So how are we two different sentient beings? And so with that in mind, Dharmakirti wrote a separate text. Then he's written another text, which is, just so that you realize the importance, which is just called Sambandha Pariksha, which is Javatapa. It's just an analysis of relations. Because relations play such a central part of Indian philosophy, and relations were considered by, I think it was the Vaisheshikas, to be a separate real entity. That is what guarantees things staying together. Yeah? So with the non-Buddhists, they speak of different divisions of phenomena. Amongst these different divisions of phenomena, there's one category of phenomena which is relations, which is sambandhana in how it's called in literature. But that explanation is so important and is so pivotal because it's explaining why things are not random, right? There's no randomness. And so in the explanation of why things are not random, they've had to develop a theory of why things are related to each other. And in that, the non-Buddhists speak of relations as real entities. And Dharmakirti felt the need to clarify that relations are conceptual, they're not real entities. So things are related, but the relation that binds them is something that requires conceptualization for you to know it. So he wrote a separate text for that. So those are the 7 texts of Dharmakirti. Then Dharmakirti's only written a commentary for the first text. He hasn't written any other commentary to his own text for the first chapter of the first text. And then the second, third, fourth chapter has no auto commentary. Okay? And his students were charged, or they were asked to write commentaries. So there's 2 main students. Devendra Buddhi and Shakya Shri Buddhi. These are the 2 Indian authors. And I think Shakya Shri Buddhi was a senior one. And he's supposed to have he's only written a commentary from the second text onwards, second chapter onwards, because Dharmakirti's already done the first chapter, so he didn't feel the need to write that. So his text only has a commentary of the second, third and fourth chapter. But the story goes that when he presented the first commentary to Dharmakirti, Dharmakirti said, "This is rubbish, fix it." And so then he did a second one, and Dharmakirti said, "Not good enough." And he said, "Fix it." And I think there was a third or the fourth attempt. He said, "I'm too old, I can't write anymore. Please accept it." So Dharmakirti says, "Okay." And it's accepted. And so that is in the canon, in the Tengyur, you find this. It's commentary to the second, third, fourth chapter. But in the Pramana-Vatika itself, Dharmakirti writes almost in like a sad tone towards the end of the text, saying, "No one has understood the real intention of my text, so when I die, like a drop getting reabsorbed back into the ocean, the meaning of my Pramana-Vatika is just going to go away with me." So what we study are so then there's these 2 main students. These became largely the 2 interpretations that prevailed. But neither of them, we have this, we say this, and so it's like, when you elevate things to like a cult status, so it's like no one really understands the Pramana-Vatika. Because that's how profound it is. Yeah? Does that make sense? So that's what the text that we're studying. Okay? So our content matter is centering around... But there's also the story of Dharmakirti. You wanted stories, right? Yeah, but let me just say one thing. So, the subject matter, so now you know the subject matter, right? The subject matter of Pramana is how do you gain knowledge of phenomena, so inferentially or directly, and then once you have gained knowledge of phenomena, how do you transmit it to others? So through consequences and proof statements. That's what we're reading right now, proof statement. Okay? Yeah? So these are the 2 ways in which you make other people realize, but they have to be preceded by your understanding. That's the entire content. Yeah? So there is no content in terms of this is what emptiness means. It doesn't have any of that. It just means this is how inference works. This is how you gain access to things via inference. So this is inference, this is how the conceptual mind works. This is direct perception, this is how it gains access. Once you have understood it, how do you make other people realize? First you give them consequences, and then after you've given them consequences, you give them proof statements. That's the subject matter. So the subject matter of pramana is generally divided into 8 things. Valid inference, not valid inference, valid perception, not valid perception, valid proof statements, not valid proof statements, valid consequences and non-valid consequences. Just that. Yeah. So how do you distinguish between correct and incorrect knowledge, essentially? So epistemology is actually a very accurate translation of this kind of study. Yeah? Okay? So that's what the compendium of valid cognition is. This is this text that you're seeing. When you see it, it is the Pramana Samuchaya. It is written in verses, and then Dignaga has written a self-commentary to it as well. I think both have been translated in English. But they're very scholarly translations, so the terminology is very, very technical. But you do find them, yeah? Okay. So here he says, Acharya Dignaga, he says, inference for the purpose of others makes clear the fact seen by oneself. So these 2 verses themselves, these 2 lines, are the entire content matter of pramana, right? What you have seen for yourself, then you make clear for others. To make it clear for others, you have to see it. You can see it in 2 ways, inference, direct perception. Others will be led to seeing it through consequences and proof statements, right? So it's also, you start to notice in India, I've heard this, I've never read, I can't even read Sanskrit, so I don't even know how beautiful he is, but Dharmakirti is also considered one of the greatest poets in India ever to have lived. So it's very concise, very short, but it's very pregnant with meaning. So when we do the first chapter, you'll just find like 4 lines, and then you have so much meaning that comes out of it. Yeah?
Dharmakirti or Jnana?
Both. They both write in verses. Dharmakirti was considered the real kind of like. In fact, there's when they study Dharmakirti in Sanskrit, they say he made up his own Sanskrit a little bit to explain things. People who study Dharmakirti in Sanskrit, the scholars, they really, really appreciate him very much. The phrase seen for oneself indicates that it is not enough for the 3 modes demonstrated by a proof statement to be merely accepted by the opponent. Yeah? Rather, they must be ascertained by the valid cognition of both the proponent and the opponent. The word facts indicates that it is not enough for these 3 modes to demonstrated by a proof statement to be posited by scriptural citation alone. Rather, the empirical facts must be established as an object of valid cognition. The phrase indicates that when demonstrating the 3 modes to an opponent by means of a proof statement so as to produce a recollecting awareness that recalls the 3 modes, it must be free from the faults of exceeding the 3 modes and of not satisfying the 3 modes. Exposition of valid cognition, that's Dharmakirti. Okay? Also, we're doing all of this preliminary stuff because tomorrow you have your final Dura debate. So just debate that right now, okay? Get familiar with the Tariq and you're preparing for that. When we finish that debate, then we'll start the Tariq debates, okay? Yeah? Some say that since it is others who are to be instructed through the proof statement, the evidence that is understood by the other, even if it is not seen by oneself, is a means of proof. The words seen by oneself serve to counter this false opinion. So Dharmakirti also says it. Passages such as these show extensively that a correct proof statement must be free from the faults of wording, factual definition, and cognition. Yeah? An example of a proof statement with faulty wording is sound is impermanent because it is produced, an example is pot. And just as a pot is produced, so sound is produced. Therefore, sound is produced. Sound is impermanent. A proof statement such as this has the fault of being both an excessive and an insufficient statement. By explicitly expressing its thesis, sound is impermanent, this proof statement has the fault of excessive wording. And by not expressing the pervasion, it has the fault of insufficient wording. Also, it has the fault of repetition because the application of the example to the case at hand, and just as a pot is produced, so sound is produced, repeats the expression of the evidence as an attribute of the subject because it is produced. So not only are they concerned with wording it correct, with understanding it correctly, the wording has to be really spot on. So pramana is very precise. They try and be as precise as possible. So you say the same thing twice, it's redundant. There's a fault in how you've worded it. If what you're saying is not clear, it's insufficient. If what you're saying is incomplete, it's insufficient. Yeah? So technically, when you speak too much in the debate courtyard, you're making these mistakes. Do you see why it's important? Like, not do you see why, but there is a reason why people ask you to stay very tight within the rules and follow them closely. Because the effort here is that it's very concise. And the reason for concision, you can say, is, oh well, but if you can still translate it and understand it with lots of words, what's the problem? There is a problem, because when you're sitting down and thinking by yourself and you're trying to gain certainty, if you have too much stuff that just confuses you and adds a lot of junk to your thoughts, then it takes away your ability to reason or to get clarity on something. So that's why concision is considered very relevant and very helpful, yeah? So technically you can say this, but that doesn't mean it's a correct thing, yeah?
I didn't understand the last thing.
So you can say this.
Can't say what?
This long-winded statement, the proof statement, you can say it like this. And it'll even lead to some level of communication, but it's not technically a proof statement, yeah? So here, see how they should be. And by not expressing the pervasion, yeah. Also it has the fault of repetition, because the application of that's fine, yeah. And the conclusion, therefore sound is impermanent, repeats the expression of the thesis, sound is impermanent. It is said this kind of faulty proof statement has 5 parts. The 5 parts are the thesis, the evidence as an attribute of the subject, the concordant example, the application of the example to the case at hand, and the conclusion. According to both masters, Dignaga and Dharmakirti, a proof statement having 5 parts is faulty. They explain that a proof statement has just 2 parts, the pervasion and the evidence as an attribute of the subject. So therefore there are 2 kinds of correct proof statements. A correct proof statement expressed in terms of, how do you pronounce this word? Homologous cause, and a correct proof statement in terms of heterogeneous cause. Case. The definition of what is this translating? My God, wait. Okay. The definition of the former is a flawless 2-part statement explicitly demonstrating without any fault in the wording, factual reference and cognition that the evidence present only within the set of homologous cause of the thesis is established. An example is the proof statement, and now this is like the Socrates one, yeah? If something is produced, it is pervaded by being impermanent. An example is a pot. Sound is also produced. Yeah? Okay? Yeah? So what's your thesis? Make a syllogism. What is the syllogism to prove that sound is impermanent? With this, when you say sound is impermanent, because it is, take sound, it is impermanent because it is produced, right? That's your syllogism. You have a subject, you have a predicate, you have a reason. What's the thesis? Sound is produced. Correct? Sorry, sound is impermanent, my mistake. Sound is impermanent, right? And so far what you're familiar with is the reason has to be established for it to be a correct syllogism, and there has to be pervasion. That's how we've been saying it, right? So now you look at 1 and 2. 1 refers to there has to be pervasion. So the pervasion, yeah? And 2, the evidence as an attribute of the subject is whether the reason is established or not. So technically, there's nothing that's new here for you. Yeah? A syllogism is take sound, it is impermanent because it is produced. Sound is the subject, impermanent is the predicate, produced is the reason, the thesis is sound is impermanent. If it is valid or not is determined by whether the reason is established, which is attribute of the subject, and pervasion. That's something that you're already familiar with. What we haven't done, which we'll touch upon today, is the correct concordant example. Now, this is all stuff that you will be debating and you will have the definitions of very soon. This is just a general introduction so you know how to orient yourself. Yeah? Yeah.
So the reason is the evidence? What?
Yeah. In our text, evidence is how they're translating reason. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. Now again, Anastasia, this is again related to what you were saying, which is how does it start from experience? That's this example. Yeah? So another thing that's extremely important in Indian debate, or in Indian, not debate, sorry, in Indian reasoning, is that it has to be founded on an example. Okay? We'll debate that in lots of detail later, but just for now, an example, for instance, is pot over here. It says, right? Whatever is produced is pervaded by being impermanent. For example, a pot. Sound is also produced. That's our proof statement, proving the homologous cause. Cause, it says, case, right. Okay, so you'll see what that means in a minute. But is that clear? Now, the thing of adding a pot is important because for you to know the pervasion, if it is produced, it has to be impermanent. It can't be abstract. That's what it means. Okay? It has to start from your verification directly of production being pervaded by impermanent. So since you can't have an abstract understanding, but it has to be tied to reality, you have to have a concordant example. Otherwise, it's purely theoretical. Yeah? So whatever you do in debate has to be founded in an example for you to generate inference of it elsewhere. So if I need to understand that sound is impermanent with the reason product, I have to be sure that product, being a product, necessarily entails that it is impermanent. So I have to have reasoned this out. And to reason it out, I have to have thought about it somewhere. I have to see something that's produced. I have to see that it is impermanent. And when I know these two, then only I can understand the relation between product and impermanent. So the base that helps me realize the relation is an example. So the thing that you don't have yet is the correct example. So we call it a correct concordant example. Without an example, you cannot generate inference. Okay? Now when we're debating, however, we don't use examples. Yeah? We don't use examples because we're just trying to make sense of reasoning. So what we're doing in debate is actually consequences. Yeah? What we do in debate, when we're debating, is actually we're using consequences. Okay? Yeah? Yeah.
Is an example necessarily known through direct perception?
So this is another issue that comes up later. Of course, you will, I think if we're doing a general introduction, it's okay to say it now. There are two kinds of reasons, right? So, Dignaga in his text, he says, the two signs of a reason, which means it can be seen directly or inferentially. However, that inferential realization of an example, when you trace it down, has to begin by a direct perception. So you have two kinds of syllogisms. One are syllogisms that are establishing impermanent on sound for the first time, but the person who's the opponent already knows impermanent, right? Like when you're establishing that on that smoky hill there's fire, you don't establish fire for the first time. You're establishing that on that hill there's fire for the first time, right? Fire has to be something you already know. So there are certain syllogisms, and this is very important, but you won't discuss it very much right now. It's a funny thing. This is now a modern teaching attempt, where we're not giving you traditional style. It's not discussed very much, but it's extremely important. And so you might as well know it because it will come up later. When we say it is hidden phenomena, slightly hidden phenomena, then inference has to make you realize it, right? So when you're talking about knowing impermanence, there has to be a first moment where you realize impermanence through a reason. It has to be, right, if that's what it means. Now, the first time you realize impermanence, your example has to be directly perceived. Once you've realized it, then you can extrapolate conceptually and understand it elsewhere. But the first realization of impermanence has to be founded on a direct perception. Yeah? So whether you are in that moment engaging in reasoning that is founded in direct perception, or it is coming from direct perception. I think, Karma, Marme like a lamp, Guma like an illusion, like a cloud, like a bubble. Yeah? Duche thamche ditarta. At the end, the Buddha says, then see all compounded phenomena to be like this. Yeah? All of those. Now, this is, listen how beautiful it is. This is a syllogism. Okay? This is a syllogism that's proving impermanence. The syllogism is take something, whatever it is impermanent because it is compounded. For example, a star, a bubble, an illusion, whatever it might be. Yeah? This same syllogism can use also to prove things are lacking objective existence. And your example will be the same examples work here as well. Okay? So when you hear things like a reflection, like a mirage, like an echo, those are all examples. Those are correct, concordant examples being used in syllogisms to either prove impermanence or selflessness or emptiness. Yeah? Now how does it work? First, you understand that if something is compounded or something is a compound, what is it? Composite phenomena? What are we calling it? Conditioned. If something is a conditioned phenomena, it has to be impermanent, right? But say you want to understand this on sound, or say you want to understand it on the pillar. You're not seeing the pillar being impermanent, right? So when you use an example such as the bubble, you see the bubble is impermanent because it was compounded or conditioned by the fact that water had to bang somewhere and then there had to be like an air, something. I don't even know how bubbles are formed. Whatever the mechanics of a bubble is, you see that, and you see that because those conditions brought it together, it had a limited duration and so it popped at some point. That is directly known. So you don't need reasoning to show that the bubble pops. So you see a bubble being made by things. Then you see those same things that made the bubble come into existence make it end. Same thing with lightning. You see lightning being formed by, now you'll say static electricity, whatever you want to call it. And because it's only there, that charge is only there for a while, there's a short thing. All those examples are very short things, you can see them. Illusions come for a while and then they go like that, right? That's when you prove that if something is conditioned, it has to be impermanent directly. Yeah? You still don't know impermanence. You don't know what impermanence really means. Because that's an obvious form of something staying for a bit and going away. That's not impermanence. Impermanence means while it's abiding, it's simultaneously disintegrating. So the impermanence of this pillar should be a lot more, uncomfortable than we make it out to be right now, right? Like the ground under your feet is currently disintegrating. That's how it should feel. So when you first understand the pervasion on an example, that's called the understanding of gross impermanence. We say gross impermanence, right? Then when you look at, you understand the relation between if it is conditioned, it has to be disintegrating, and then you apply it to this pillar, then your understanding of the pillar, the information that is being given to your intuition is that it is stable. The reasoning is showing you that it is disintegrating and therefore it is unstable. So the first time you understand disintegration on a phenomenon where it's not obvious, that's when you realize it for the first time. That reason has to be grounded in direct perception. So this is the kind of syllogism that is proving hidden phenomena for the first time. Same thing with like emptiness. Emptiness means it doesn't exist objectively, right? So when you're seeing a reflection in a mirror, you're saying it's not objectively a face. Why is it not objectively a face? Because it is dependently arisen, or whatever you wanted to say, right? Then when you understand it on this pillar, which however is harder to say it is a projection of your mind, and then you understand it, that's the first time you understand emptiness or impermanence. Yeah? From that moment onwards, then you don't need to use those kind of examples, because you've understood impermanence and you've understood the pervasion that if it is produced, it has to be impermanent. From then on, you can use all sorts of examples. And now the examples are used as reminders to remind you that, hey, if it's produced, it has to be impermanent. Remember how you understood it on a pot last time? The same criteria are met here. So don't be misled. This also comes up in the first chapter, yeah? So what you'll do in the first chapter, you really don't need to take notes because you're going to be doing this very much, but up to you. Okay? So what this means is examples are used for two people. When you're newly proving something to someone, you need to do a lot more reasoning. When they've already understood the pervasion, then an example is used as a reminder. Yeah? And without a reminder, your mind will not be able to recall that information, so you need it. And without having understood it ever, you need something for the first time. Okay? Yeah? Now there's a whole section in the Pramana-Vartika where there's 3-4 verses that come this year where Dharmakirti mentions the utility of an example. Okay? So that's how examples work. Anastasia, does that help you get more clarity on how it boils down to experience? Yeah? Okay. So it's a very important point, this one. It's not secondary information. Just remember this because this is extremely relevant. Yeah?
It's also
Yeah.
mentioned in the introductory essay, I find.
Yeah. Okay? So this is how you express it, right? So now there's just another side fact. Initially there was a theory that Buddhist epistemology comes from Greek logic, because the Greeks were in India at that time. But then they've read another article that said that, however, Indian epistemology predates Greek logic. So maybe when the Greeks came to India, they took it back. So we don't know. But why I'm saying it is this: the way the statement is stated is very similar. All humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Therefore, Socrates is immortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. There's just no mention of an example in this statement. So if ever one of you wants to do some research, please let me know if you come up with an answer to this. The Buddhist one is whatever is produced has to be impermanent. And then there's the addition of, for example. Yeah? For example, a pot, sound is produced. So when someone hears this, they said everything that is produced is impermanent, you immediately give them an example that brings this pervasion to mind. So they're like, oh, like a pot, yeah. And then you say sound is produced. So you immediately connect sound is produced. If it is produced, it has to be impermanent. So the next moment you immediately realize that sound is impermanent. That's how inference is generated. Yeah? Okay? Okay, that's it. So that's this one. An example is the proof statement. If something is produced, it is pervaded by being impermanent. An example is a pot. Sound is also produced. Through adducing the example, this statement applies the example and the evidence as homologous instances of the predicate to be proven. Hence it is called a correct proof statement expressed in terms of a homologous cause. Case. Homologous? I know, but do you like it? It's okay? Yeah? Okay. So that's why, Mark. What does it mean? No, seriously. It's similar, concordant, can we use that? The opposite of heterogeneous, right?
No, but it's also related to, you say, analogy.
Yeah.
So it has that logic.
Yeah. So I don't,
But what it means here?
So here it means you're trying to prove that sound is impermanent by the sign product the way you had understood it on pot. So your reasoning, you're looking at it in one perspective, which is in the perspective of how you understood it on a pot. So the way you understood that a pot has to be impermanent because it is produced, here you are reasoning to prove that sound is impermanent in a similar way. Similar way. Now the opposite one is also very interesting, which is now the next one. It says, the definition of the latter, that is in terms of a heterogeneous case, is a flawless two-part statement explicitly demonstrating without any fault in the wording, factual reference and cognition that the evidence is necessarily absent in the set of heterogeneous cases if the thesis is established. This is also very beautiful. So for example, if something is permanent, it is pervaded by being not produced. For example, space, right? Which is not causally conditioned. And then sound, and then you can put in brackets if you want, however, is produced. So that's thinking of it differently. If something is permanent, it cannot be produced. For example, space. So now you have a correct discordant example. You're not thinking of it only in one way. You have to think of it in both ways. That's why you have to understand relation and contradiction. Does it make sense now? You have to understand product is related to impermanent on an example. You have to understand that there is no common locus between permanent and product on an example. What example? Space. Correct? So space is a common locus of permanent and unproduced. So you have to know the opposite of the thesis. You have to know the opposite of the predicate, and you have to establish it. Then you can use that negative reasoning to prove your thesis also. You can say, if something is permanent, it can't be produced. For example, space. However, sound is produced. So you're like, oh right, then if it's produced, it can't be permanent. So you're saying the same thing, but you're saying it in two different ways. You're approaching it in two different ways. Yeah? So for it to now become a correct reason, it's not just sufficient to have one way of thinking. Now when we do the definition in Tariq of reasons, you see how rich it is. It needs a lot of material. Yeah? One is, the reason has to be established. Two is, there has to be a pervasion, but in that pervasion, you have to show that it is related to the predicate through an example. And you have to also know that it is no common locus with the opposite through another example. When you have all this information, then you are in a position to generate inference. That's what this means, yeah? So again, in his book, he always gives an example. He says, like when, your parents are trying to convince you to study hard, you should study hard because then you'll be like this cousin of yours, right? Study hard, you will have success in life. For example, this uncle or this cousin, right? And if you don't study hard, then you won't have good success. For example, that uncle or that other cousin, right? So when you have seen these two and you are familiar with both sides, that if you study hard, you will make it. For example, whatever cousin or uncle you had who's very successful, and then that other uncle who's not doing very well because they didn't work hard, or they they didn't finish their study. It's a very typical example, right, that parents give kids. That's just another way of illustrating that this way of thinking is familiar to us. We do it all the time. So we also need examples to prove things to us, yeah? So now, it's becoming a little bit more complex, right? Okay? So that's what a proof statement is. You can prove something in two ways. Either according to the homologous case or through the heterogeneous case, yeah? You're proving the same thing though. Is that okay? So, that's how this is going to work, okay? Yeah. Both are proving sound is impermanent, yeah. Because what will happen in the heterogeneous case is you'll say, however sound is produced, and so when you're saying, if it is permanent, it cannot be produced, and then you say, but sound is produced, immediately it's going to click in your realization that therefore it can't be permanent. And so that amounts to saying that it is impermanent. It's just the way you approach it. So for you, we've done this just as a reminder. For all of you, it's the discord. It is the counter pervasion. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Could we describe this also
How?
In the sense that the homologous case is some type of being one, and the heterogeneous case is some type of being different.
I don't know if you can say that, because this will also be in the relations where the reason and the predicate are one entity. You can say it's substantially one or one entity, but then there's also relations where you're proving smoke with fire. I don't know if you could do that with that. How would you do
But I
that?
mean, wouldn't there be divisions of one? Some division of one?
I guess we'll have to see later. I don't think so though. Take on that smoky hill. Take that smoky hill, it follows there's fire because there's smoke. I don't think you have any one or different here, do you?
The relationship between fire and smoke?
Yeah, that's a causal relationship, remember? Smoke is causally related to fire. So it is different entities. It won't be one in this case, it will be different. Or are you saying the reasoning will employ some concept of one and different?
Well, I don't know, maybe we don't need to.
But eventually, but it won't always be the same, it will depend on the kind. So how would you make a proof statement for proving that? Actually, I'm curious, let's just see. How would you make a proof statement proving that on that smoky hill there is fire with the reason smoke? How would you say it? Can you come up with one?
If something has smoke,
If there is smoke,
it is pervaded by having fire as its cause.
by the existence of fire. Do you remember the 8 modes of existence and the 8 modes of being? Now the existence one kicks in. If fire exists, if smoke exists, it is pervaded by the existence of fire.
An example is that hill.
Is?
That hill?
No, that hill is your subject.
Was that to come up with a difference?
In the kitchen, or when you had a bonfire last night, or when you lit your paper, or whatever that was, right? For example, that.
For example, when I lit my paper,
Yeah.
which is...
That's it. For example, when you lit the paper, and on that hill there is smoke. That's it. Yeah? Does that make sense?
Say it again.
Wherever there is fire, the existence of fire is pervaded by the existence of smoke is pervaded by the existence of fire. For example, when that person lit that cigarette, just as a most obvious example, okay? That's an example. Then, even on that smoky hill, there is smoke. So when you think of lighting the cigarette and you see it burning and you see smoke coming out of it, or when you light a fire, a bonfire, and you see smoke coming out of it, that acts as an example to remind you that the smoke came because there was fire. Right? And then you'd say on that hill there's smoke. So you'll be like, oh, okay, so that has to be fire. The other way is the non-existence of fire is pervaded by the non-existence of smoke. For example, in the freezer. However, on that smoky hill, there is smoke. So what you're saying is, you look in the freezer and you're like, oh, there's no smoke, of course there's no fire, there's nothing that is igniting the fire. So in the absence, remember, the absence of fire necessarily entails the absence of smoke. You understand it in the freezer. When you understand it in the freezer as an example, then later you're like, but on the smoky hill there is smoke. So then there has to be fire. So you can reason it in both ways. It comes to the same conclusion. Okay? Yeah? Is that okay?
Sir?
Yeah?
In this case, the subject is not the first part of the sentence?
The subject is the smoky hill.
Yeah, but it's not the first position of the sentence.
No, when you're making a proof statement, the pervasion is the first part of the sentence.
Okay.
Yeah?
Can you lay out those parts of the proof statement? So the pervasion, and then
Like a thesis and then an example.
No, so it's exactly what it says here. There's a pervasion and an evidence. The pervasion is cited through, see in the definition, they explain the proof statement has 2 parts. Remember, that's what it says, a pervasion and a attribute of the subject. That's all it means. The pervasion, to express it, has to be expressed on an example. That's all that's being said. So you have to express a pervasion, and then you have to express the subject with the reason. So you have to say whatever is produced has to be permanent. For example, a pot. Sound is also produced. Whatever is permanent has to be unproduced. For example, space. Sound, however, is produced. That's it.
What is the use of a proof statement compared to the use of a syllogism?
Nothing. It's the same. It's the same. It amounts to the same thing. It amounts to the same thing. Yeah? This is actually an interesting point because when they debate, in Indian text, somehow, it's like Dignaga and Dharmakirti, you see a lot more proof statements being used. When you read someone like Bhavaveka, you see a lot more syllogisms being cited. So they're the same thing. Take sound, it is impermanent because it is produced, for example, a pot. Right? Whatever is produced is necessarily impermanent. For example, a pot, sound is produced. The content is the same of both of these things. Yeah? It's just how you're saying it that's slightly different. Okay?
You said the proof statement has a provision and the attribute.
Yeah.
So what's the attribute in this?
Attribute of the subject.
Or the subject?
Yeah? So what we've been calling property of the subject.
I see. Attribute of the subject is what is the attribute?
Attribute of the subject is sign, the reason. Is the reason, yeah. So, are we going to make changes? I mean, everywhere it's property of the subject. Everywhere. Now here they translate it as attribute. What do we do?
It's so close in meaning, though.
It is, but okay, so let's keep it like this, but just learn that other texts, in fact 90% of the English translations I've seen, always translate it as property of the subject. Yeah?
Okay. So attribute, property.
It's the same.
all the same.
It's the same. This is the translation choice. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I know this is what to do.
So this heterogeneous.
This is a correct proof statement proving the concordant class a correct proof statement. So that's exactly what. Similar class and dissimilar class, that's what it is, yeah. That's the other way of translating it.
And one is the provision and the other counter.
Yeah, that's it. It's very simple. You know, 84,000 is trying really hard to get consistency in their translations and their editorial policies. You can see that it's important, no? Then can I just say, can you start appreciating the efforts by Tibetans who translated from roughly 800 AD to 1400 AD, and they translated all the Kangyur, all the Tengyur and other Indian texts and tried to maintain a terminological consistency. And we're reading 2 volumes that have different translations. Where the same chapter has 2 different translations.
So is that reflective of like a very strong collective?
I think so. I think they had an incredible Samye, that monastery in Tibet, they had like levels of it. And there was like a whole section that was just Indian Pandits and Tibetan scholars sitting there standardizing terminology. So when His Holiness says Tibetan is very accurate, there are certain scholars who say it's not as accurate as Sanskrit. Maybe. But I mean, it's definitely better than English. It's incredibly accurate. Like to hold on that consistency for good 500-600 years is really hard. We've got people making translation changes in the last 30 years of English translation. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. So His Holiness is absolutely spot on when he praises them.
Created the accuracy of Sanskrit.
That was an Indian context. It was just the context it was used in India for the accuracy of Sanskrit, you mean in terms of terminological consistency, or?
Yes.
I don't know.
It always has to come from a collective effort.
Yeah, I don't know the Indian context as much. That would be interesting to find out. I know the Tibetans did it as a translation exercise. In fact, they coined many new terms, right? But then when someone coined the term, they kept it. Maybe a later translator was like, I don't like that, I want to call it something else. But they didn't, they just kept it. Yeah? So it's nice that way. Whereas now first you had self-know, now you have reflexive awareness, tomorrow someone's going to turn around and call it something else. And then there's lost faces like yours who are like, what are we going to do with this? Right? So attribute of subject, property of subject, these are all just, it's the same thing. Okay? Yeah. The purpose of using a correct proof statement expressed in terms of a homologous case, such as proving that sound is impermanent as evidenced by being produced, is to remove doubt that being produced is contradictory evidence in the proof that sound is impermanent. Again, that's not terms that you know yet. The purpose of using a correct proof statement expressed in terms of heterogeneous case, such as proving that sound is impermanent as evidenced by being produced, is to remove doubt that being produced is inconclusive evidence in the proof that sound is impermanent. Yeah? For instance, when you're saying it with the first case, you're saying sound is impermanent because it is produced, right? You're making it clear that production is contrary to permanence. Yeah? You're saying if it is produced, it has to be permanent. It doesn't have any other option. It's not contradictory to permanent. Right? And in the other case, you're saying if it is permanent, it follows it is not produced. You're removing doubt with respect to the second case, which is production could have a common locus with permanent. Yeah? So you're saying the same thing, but you're saying it in different ways. Okay? So ascertainment of valid cognition. What is this? Right. Ascertainment is another text by Dharmakirti. It's Samanamani. Referring to Dignaga. Ascertainment will be pramana. What is it in Sanskrit? I don't even know.
So this would be in the body, the three bodies?
Yeah. This is the procedure. Both should be stated as antidotes to exclude contradictory and inconclusive evidence. Yeah? With regard to there being many different recipients and of purposes for positing an object in a proof statement, exposition of valid cognition says, regarding the example, the fact that the thesis is of the nature of the evidence or that it is the cause of the evidence is demonstrated to someone who does not know that relationship. Please note relationship is not, it's relation over here, okay? For those who know, the evidence alone is stated. Therefore, if one knows the relation between evidence and predicate, the statement of either one of the two will by implication recall to mind the other. Yeah? Do you remember that thing? So if you know both, you just need to remind one and the other one will come implicitly. It comes in. If you don't know both, then you have to prove both. By proving the relationship, to prove the relationship, you have to prove. Just think of that. What's the definition of relationship? Let's do that quickly. What's the definition of something being related to A being related to B? Okay, the absence of B necessarily entails the absence of A. What's the definition of A and B contradictory? They are distinct. A and B are distinct phenomena, and there is with no possible common locus between A and B. So to understand the relation of A being related to B, correct? You have to show that the absence of B necessarily entails the absence of A. So you have to show that there is no common locus between not B and not A. To understand that A is related to B, you have to show that not B necessarily entails not A. So to do this, you have to first prove that not B and not A cannot have a common locus. So you have to prove that not B and not A are contradictory. To prove relations, you can't but prove contradictory. Yeah? Yeah? Does that make sense? That's why it's another division of ascertainable objects. Yeah? So that's what Dharmakirti is saying over here. He's saying if you know that they are contradictory, you've already understood the relation, then you just go with one. You just say one of these two. If it is produced, it follows it as impermanent. For example, a pot. Sound is also produced. You just leave it at that. All of it will just come in. That content will just be reminded of that. Yeah? But if you don't know both, if you don't know the relation, then you say first, if it is produced, it has to be impermanent. For example, a pot. So first you think of it like that. Then you also have to understand the opposite, because you have to understand that it has to be related to impermanence. So, and the absence of impermanence necessarily leads to the absence of produced. So you're understanding it on an example such as space. Wherever there is no impermanence, there can be no production. For example, space. So you understood the relation and the contradiction. You understood the homologous class and the heterogeneous case. When you've got both of them, then again you can just say one. Got it? So there's a whole process. Yeah? It's really quite elegant.
First part you said was if A is related to B, then not B and not A
Cannot have a common locus. Yeah. For example?
But both is related to impermanent, but not impermanent and not both have a common locus.
No, sorry. My mistake. Not B and A. Yeah, not B and A can't have a common locus.
Not what?
Not B and A can't have a common locus.
And A.
And A. Yeah. Not A. Yeah, exactly. A. Yeah. Okay?
Can you please repeat that if it is?
If A is related to B, then the absence of B necessarily entails the absence of A. For that, not B and A can't have a common. You have to prove that before. Yeah, thanks. Yeah? Yeah.
So can one think of the homologous case as kind of showing there is correlation, and then with the heterogeneous case you show that it's not just correlation, it's kind of also correlation. Do you know that? Like it's not just.
I don't think better maybe not to say causation, because causation is very specific. Yeah, so don't say causation, maybe.
It's
Yeah.
causal
So what you
relation.
call that is counter-pervasion.
Like to
When-
me, it seems like counter-pervasion shows that it's not just a coincidental co-appearance.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, good. That point that you just made, yeah, okay. Just keep that in mind, because later, when the first chapter gets, this year what we're touching on the first chapter is precisely this. But what you're saying is incomplete, in the sense that to show the homologous case, you have to already know the heterogeneous case. Which means to show that there is concomitance, is that the word that you use? What did you use? Correlation.
Coincidental. Which one now?
No, the first one, correlation you said, right? To show correlation, you have to show that it is not it's not coincidental. Yeah, that's precisely the point that Dharmakirti is going to make later.
So what do you understand by correlation?
Correlation, so what I'm understanding is what is the technical definition of correlation, where it's related.
Oh, okay.
Relation.
Okay.
To show that A is related to B, even though when you just say it like this, it sounds like it could be coincidental, or you've observed it in one situation and therefore it's not leading to certainty of counter-pervasion or of it being always like that. Dharmakirti's point is to say that this has to be related to that is preceded by an understanding of the counter-pervasion. That's why the definition of relation is there. Does that make sense?
Okay.
If A is related to B, implicit in that understanding has to be that the absence of B cannot allow for A. So coincidentality, is that even a word?
Coincidental co-appearance, I call it. No, but
Yeah, that's not possible.
no, but I think correlation, like for example in economics, would be something that appears at the same time, but they don't have any relation whatsoever. And so,
Yeah, so then
Yeah.
that's not what here is.
so I think
That's not
okay,
correlation
that's something
there.
correlation.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thus, Dharmakirti explains how a proof statement needs to be made to those people who have no knowledge of the relation between the evidence and the predicate with regard to the example, either the intrinsic relation or the causal relation between the evidence and the predicate. Now, if you hadn't done Dudra and you were reading this, what would you even understand? Zero. And if you learned Dudra and not debated, how much could you test this? Zero. So there is a progression, right? So that they may gain an understanding of the true evidence-predicate relations. To those opponents who are versed in both forms of the pervading relation, yet do not know the evidence is an attribute of the subject, one must present a proof statement so that they understand just the evidence or just the attribute of the subject. However, to those who already know the attribute of the subject and both forms of pervading relation, one need not posit a proof statement for the purpose of their understanding something they do not know yet. Rather, Dharmakirti states that one must posit a proof statement expressed in either terms of homologous cases or in terms of heterogeneous cases in order to induce a simultaneous recollection of all three modes. Also, since a correct proof statement expressed in terms of a homologous case shows that the evidence is present only in the set of homologous instances of what is proven, one can implicitly know that the evidence, one can implicitly know that the evidence is not present in the set of heterogeneous cases of that proof. Conversely, since a proof statement expressed in terms of a heterogeneous case explicitly shows that the evidence is only absent in a set of the heterogeneous instances of what is proven, one can implicitly know that the evidence is present in just the homologous cases. Therefore, for a single opponent, a proof statement expressed in terms of either homologous cases or heterogeneous cases individually is sufficient. So it is said that there is no need to directly posit both. In brief, for someone who has ascertained and not forgotten that the evidence is an attribute of the subject, the pervasion is expressed in order to establish the positive and negative pervasions. For someone who has ascertained and not forgotten the positive and negative pervasions, one states that the evidence is an attribute of the subject and in order to establish the evidence is an attribute of the subject. For someone who has ascertained and not forgotten that the evidence is an attribute of the subject, along with the positive and negative pervasions, both are expressed. Also, there are cases in which the proof... Do you see how much detail is needed when you're talking to someone else? It's not at all easy, right? Yeah?
May I request slower reading?
For this. I'm just reading it later.
When we're talking about the three modes as a simultaneous recollection of all the three modes, we're talking about correct proof statement, flawless statement.
No, your three modes we'll do, Venerable. Three modes is the main thing, but it's just basically pervasion and attribute of subject. They become three when you say attribute, positive pervasion, negative pervasion. So pervasions are both ways, right? A is related to B because not B leads to not A. So there's a positive aspect and a negative aspect. We call those three modes, but it's just pervasion. Yeah.
Is it the same as forward and reverse pervasion?
Yes, exactly. Now there'll be 100 different translations of that as well. Exactly. Yeah.
Does homologous cases and heterogeneous cases also in some way refer to forward pervasion and reverse pervasion?
Yes. Yeah. See, so exactly. Yeah.
So you say pervasion, no pervasion?
There's, like it says over here, I think positive pervasion, negative pervasion, and attribute of subject. But that's coming now. See, just so that you all know what we're getting at here. Look at page 312. The inferential evidence, the explicit content of a proof statement. So right now we're talking about how statements are made, how you can say them, what needs to be said, what needs to be omitted, blah blah blah. Then we're going to say, this is the thesis, this is what you're trying to prove, and then what does it actually, how do you do it? And then you have the three modes, yeah? Okay, so here, you'll see it here. On 313, the three modes of correct evidence are also presented in Dharmakirti's exposition of valid cognition. This, yeah? This verse, just by the way, is the first verse of the first chapter of the Pramanavartika. Yeah? The opening verse of the Pramanavartika is, these are the three modes of the correct sign. They exist because there is a relation. Everything else is wrong. Period. So it's kind of that, and we'll be doing that also later, yeah? So this is where we'll actually start talking about the three modes. Then we have definitions for each one of the three modes. We'll debate the definitions of the three modes, make sure that it's clear, and then we'll go on to the divisions. Okay? So that's what Tariq is mostly. Yeah? Okay. Huh?
Homologous and heterogeneous, is it like one and different? Will it become one and different?
I think you and Mark think very similarly. It won't become one and different. I can't say it will or not because I don't know how to make that connection. So I don't know what exactly you might be thinking.
The definition.
The definition of one and different, no, because
No, like in the English,
Yeah.
These three
Oh.
becomes different, and one homologous is like one same.
So it will be similar and dissimilar, if anything. One and different, don't use those words, Naga, because one and different have technical definitions, no? Because if we start, like already there's so much fluidity with the English language, if we start then getting more fluid with things that have technical terms, then we get lost. So let's not say one and different.
Okay.
At most similar, dissimilar,
Okay.
something like that. Yeah?
Okay.
Also, there are cases in which the proof needs to be expressed first, and the three modes are established only afterwards. When someone who has understood the three modes individually is able to recollect them simultaneously, the proof statement posited earlier becomes a correct proof statement for that person.
Where are we now?
309. Now, the function of a proof statement is to give rise to an understanding that simultaneously recollects all three modes. Exposition of valid cognition says, the intrinsic ability to prove the thesis lies really in the three modes, and the ability to give rise to recollection of these three lies in the correct statement of the trimodal proof. Here, Dharmakirti explains how the intrinsic capacity to prove the thesis is correctly located in the evidence that is characterized by the three modes, and the capacity to directly produce a recollection of the three modes resides in the proof statement expressing the three modes. Yeah? Can we just carry on? Do you mind? We have 8 minutes. Or does anyone want to clarify anything? Yeah? This is not something that you have to be too concerned about now. It's just the build-up, okay? So then the thesis. What is the thesis? Now, having briefly explained the topic of proof statements, let us discuss the nature of a thesis implied by a proof statement. In general, the word thesis, or what is to be established, also known as probandum. Now, probandum is how you find it translated by many academic type things, yeah? For example, the term can refer to the purpose for which a person strives, or to what they act upon, or to the goal of their activity. Here, in this particular context of the science of reasoning, the term thesis refers to the following. Consider someone who, on the basis of taking the presence of smoke rising on a mountain pass as the evidence, infers the presence there of fire. Here, the smoke is the evidence of the reason. Yeah? Or reason. Yeah. So, see evidence or reason. Okay? They're synonymous. And given that what is being proven is the presence of fire on that smoky pass, the existence of fire on that pass is the thesis to be proven. So the thesis is just the subject and predicate combined. Yeah? So what is the thesis in the proof that a cow has wings because it is a bird? What is the subject? What is the predicate? Has wings. What's the reason? Bird. What is the thesis? Got it? Try and make a proof statement. Huh?
I don't think everybody got it.
Please say it again.
It flies because it has the wings.
No, say first. They didn't get the first one. What is the subject? A cow has wings because it has birds. Cow is the subject. What is the reason?
It is a bird because it has wings.
So what's the reason?
Because it has wings.
What's the predicate? Has wings.
Has wings.
What is the thesis?
It flies because it.
The thesis.
Bird, it's a bird.
Thesis.
Oh, the cow has.
Cow has wings.
No, cow has wings.
Perfect. Okay? If you were to make a proof statement, what would you say? Whatever has wings, whatever is a bird, no, this is not existence, this is a bird, right? Whatever is a bird.
Whatever is a bird has wings.
For example?
An eagle.
Yeah.
Cow is a bird.
Yeah, there. And you immediately know what part is not correct over here. There's no evidence. The reason is not established, right? Cow is not a bird. Okay? Yeah? I'm just giving you an example. You can make examples of anything. Okay? Such a thesis is to be understood on the basis of evidence. Basis of evidence is another way for referring to the subject. Okay? Okay? It is that which is to be understood. And since it is being inferred by means of evidence, it is the thing to be inferred by the evidence. Yeah? The thesis, right? The thesis is the thing to be inferred by the evidence. It is the validly inferred object, since it is the object inferred through ascertaining the three modes of valid evidence. Since it is taken as a position by a party in debate, it is the position. So this is also known as position. Yeah?
What is it?
The thesis. Paksh in Sanskrit is translated as. Yeah?
Position is thesis.
The thesis is also known as position because it's what the person is going to take as a position in their debate, right? Okay? And since it is taken as a proposition by the party in debate, it is the proposition. So, thesis, position, proposition are all synonyms. There are different ways to talk about it. So, in Tibetan, one is damcha, one is drupcha, and I don't even know what the third one they're translating as proposition here is. Damcha, drupcha, chok. Chok is, yeah?
Assertion.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could add a fourth if you wanted. Yeah, but so these three English translations are technically translating three separate Sanskrit and Tibetan words. Yeah. In the view of the above, the presence of fire is referred to the predicate of the thesis. Yeah. So just getting familiar with the terminology. Take a smoky pass. It follows there is fire because there is smoke. The existence of fire is the predicate. Correct? Since it is the particular or universal feature of the thesis, the existence of fire on that pass, the smoky pass is the locus of debate, or the basis of debate, or the basis of the thesis, or the basis of evidence, right? Because it's where the debate is happening, correct? It's what you're debating. The smoky pass is the base of your analysis. The presence of fire is what you are analyzing. And the smoke is the evidence that you're giving to support your claim. Yeah? Okay? The smoky pass is the locus of debate in that it is the locus in reference to which the proponent and opponent discuss where there is fire. It is also referred to as the inferential locus, since the smoky pass is the locus where the presence of fire is being inferred through inferential cognition of the thesis. Those two expressions, the locus of debate and the inferential locus and the basis of evidence we said before, these are all synonyms. All this is from the perspective of the terminology used within the text of the science of inferential reasoning. So when you read Pramana text, you will find this terminology being used kind of interchangeably. Yeah? The thesis refers to something that is to be understood on the basis of some appropriate evidence. It can be of two types. A correct thesis such as sound is impermanence, and a fallacious thesis such as sound is permanent. Right? A thesis is just what you're trying to prove. What you're trying to prove doesn't have to exist actually. Right? You can be trying to prove anything. Right? Yeah, you can try to prove literally anything. So when you watch those little ads that say Ludo is a very good pastime which will make you a lot of money, that is potentially a false thesis, no? Like when they show those things. So a thesis is just whatever someone's trying to establish. Whether it's correct or not doesn't mean anything. What is known as a correct thesis is one that must be realized by valid inferential cognition in dependence on correct reasoning or evidence. Yeah? Within this category of a correctly reasoned thesis, there is a thesis for one's own purpose in the context of establishing a thesis by way of employing evidence for oneself, by oneself, and a correctly reasoned thesis in the context of purpose of others is known as a thesis for the purpose of others. Here, in the following, we will discuss the notion of a thesis to be proven for the sake of others. So you can have a thesis you're trying to prove to yourself, and there you use inference that is for oneself. You can have a thesis that you're trying to prove to someone else, and you need to use a reason for someone else. Now the tricky thing is when you're trying to use a reason for someone else, how much do you need to know, that is said before. Do they know the pervasion? Do they know which pervasion do they know? Do they know the do they know the positive pervasion? Do they know the negative pervasion? Are they lacking in one of the two? Do they know the evidence? Now if they know all three, have they forgotten the evidence? Have they forgotten the pervasion? If they've forgotten the pervasion, which one have they forgotten? How do you bring all of these three things together? Right? Okay? The definition of a thesis for the purpose of others is that which satisfies the 5 features: proper form, only, intended, himself, not refuted. The phrase proper form indicates that the object to be proven on that occasion is actually something to be established. It must be something that has not already been ascertained by the valid recognition of an opponent. So this classic example is trying to prove that sound is impermanent to Dharma Kirti is pointless. It's not a valid thesis for Dharma Kirti because he doesn't want to know it, right? He already knows it. Or going to Nagarjuna and it's like preaching to the choir saying, hey, things are empty of inherent existence. Yeah, sure. So it's not a correct thesis, okay? The word only indicates that the disputant takes it as something to be inferred and not as evidence, yeah? So you have to be clear what the thesis is. You can't mistake the thesis with the evidence. That's why we'll tell you often, you'll hear me say this. I'll be like, that's what you're trying to prove. Don't give it as the reason. How many times have you heard me say this? For those of you we've been debating together for a while, many times, right? Right? So when you're trying to prove something, that's your proof. You can't state the proof as the reason. The other way that we say this is you're making chapatis, right? You're just flipping it around, doesn't help, right?
Here proof means thesis.
No, proof is the reason. You can't take what you're trying to prove and give it as a reason. What you're trying to prove is that it is impermanent. You can't say why is it impermanent because it is impermanent. And this is what most people resort to when they're not sure. What in discussions on emptiness you'll find this a lot. Why is it not objectively existent? Because it's not autonomous. Okay, fine. Why is it not autonomous? Because it is merely imputed. That's the proof. Sorry, that's what you're trying to prove. That's your thesis. You can't state the thesis as proof. It doesn't help, right? So that's what this means, okay? So what we resort to in our often attempts at proving things lacking objective existence is we run through our entire arsenal of synonyms. Not autonomous, not objective, not intrinsic, not self-characterized, imputed, something, and then when you've done through 15, then you're back where you started. So that doesn't work as proof. This is the important thing. Yeah? Whatever you're giving as proof has to help you understand the thesis. Right?
Could we also say that's related to definiendum not being within its own definition?
That's also, yeah, that can also be one illustration, but oftentimes it's not only definition and definiendum. But that's interesting what you said, so mark that as well. Yeah? Okay? The word intended indicates that regardless of whether a disputant has verbally expressed it, it must be something that he accepts as the thesis to be inferred on the basis of that evidence. The word itself indicates that the disputant on that occasion must himself accept the object to be the thesis to be proven, right? So there's a lot that has to happen. And the phrase not refuted indicates that it must not be refuted by valid cognition. The Compendium of Valid Cognition says, a valid thesis is one that is intended by the disputant himself as something to be stated in the proper form only. It is not refuted. Okay. Yeah? Okay, fine. We'll stop here and then we'll finish this. So tomorrow we want to do thing, we'll just prepare for your debate. And then from Wednesday, we'll start again, yeah? And then from Wednesday, the Tariq debates will start from Wednesday. Okay?
So today was in the afternoon.
Today in the afternoon, I think... So technically what we do most commonly in the debate thing is both in the day before, we run through our debate sessions normally. On the day off, we don't have any class and we don't have any debate. We have the whole day to prepare. That's what we generally do. So tonight, this afternoon and tonight, it's just normal. Tomorrow morning we'll help prep the debate, and later we will do the thing. Mark and Archana technically have off today from the debate sessions. So if you want to sit and remember where, you're free to do that. Yeah, that's just the general protocol. Okay? Tomorrow morning you and Mark can sleep late, you can go out tonight, you can do whatever you want. Diff is over, otherwise you would have gone to diff. But that's how it technically works, okay? So on the day off tomorrow, no official debate like outside, you just prepare for the evening, okay? And I'll be there both in the morning and in the afternoon for the debate, for the preparation time. Today, you just go to debate courtyard normally. Mark and Archana are allowed to come today, but if they are gravitating around you, you need to hide your debates from them. Yeah, there's a time in the year when we do an inter-class debate, and you have 1 week off. These are really hard debates. It's really, really hard. Every year it's for 2 months. And you have 1 week off and we make notes. And every now and then the classes will send spies to try and steal the notes from the other people. So then we go off into the jungle to do the debates and we hide it under trees. It's like a... In my time it wasn't like that, but we heard stories when Gen was there. In their years they would have a lot of this espionage. So keep your debates to yourselves. Don't let Mark and Archana get them. This afternoon we'll do debate in the courtyard. If they're hanging around you, just do something else. If they're not coming, then we'll do that. I'll come and I'll listen to them. But tomorrow morning we'll be here and we'll be prepared together, okay?
Can we maybe do the prep this afternoon? Because I don't know how you feel, but I don't feel very comfortable
If you're debating,
whether we really...
you feel slightly uncertain about the thing? Would you like that? This is now up to us. There's no fixed thing. Would you rather meet here and tell me what your debates are and we try and structure? This is the first time you're ever doing it. So we're allowing some leniency. There'll be another group debate at the end of Tariq. There'll be another group debate at the end of Pramana. With each subject we close, it's also good. And in the final day that we close, will possibly also be a big group debate of Durja, Tariq and Pramana. These group debates are considered very auspicious circumstances. Yeah? Going to Damsha is considered a great conclusion for most things. So this is our first time. Would you like to do it in the afternoon? You decide, let me know. What would you like?
Today afternoon.
Today afternoon we meet here and I'll help you prepare your debates a little bit. Would you rather do that? Yeah? Okay, then Mark and Archana are definitely not allowed in here. You can try and spy around and hide under the windows. That is allowed. Huh? So I'll do 1 hour with them and then I'll come to wherever the two of you are. Okay, so from 3:30 to 4:30 I'll be here and from 4:30 to 5 I'll come there. Okay? Great. So we'll meet here at 3:30. And then whatever we're doing in the evening you can debate. You go for dinner tonight. Somewhere else. Okay?
I have one
Yeah.
question, open question, and answer later. If we can study the Naga law, they are from Indian.
Yeah.
Can we study it in Sanskrit, through Sanskrit anyway?
You know, that's the saddest thing. I don't think there's many places left. I think there might be, but I think Ramashankar Tripathi ji was one of the last ones who was teaching this. Now you could probably study it, I don't know in India, I'm sure somewhere in Bengal you can, maybe also in Pune, maybe you can. But I don't know if there's any specialists on Pramana. I think the specialists in Pramana that I'm aware of are, one is John Donne, but I think there's many in Europe, in Vienna and in Hamburg also. I think it's quite sad. It's really quite sad. Maybe in Sarnath actually you could study a little bit, but Ramashankar Tripathi ji was in Sarnath. He used to teach there. So it's almost gone, Naga. It's like, yeah, the Sanskrit lineage of Pramana and things doesn't seem to be as vibrant as it once was. Whereas the Tibetans are just, it's everywhere. It's quite amazing, yeah.
The other one is while Buddha was existing, right? It was Pali, right? Pali.
Yeah, it was Pali, I believe.
Or he's in Pali too, right?
I think the Mahayana texts came later. The Mahayana texts are primarily in Sanskrit. Apparently they were brought out by Nagarjuna. So they are all in Sanskrit. I don't think there's any Mahayana literature in Pali. Yeah, that's why we also call it, His Holiness says, sometimes call it the Pali tradition or the Sanskrit tradition instead of saying like Theravada or Hinayana, because it's slightly demeaning. But yeah, the base tradition is Pali, and those are more the common sutras, and then the Mahayana ones are all Sanskrit, to my knowledge at least.
So dedication in English. I fully dedicate all these virtues to be able to train just like the Yoga Nutri, who knows reality and just like Samantha Barbara as well. I fully dedicate all my roots of virtue with the dedication praised as the best by all the born beyond victorious ones of 3 times in order to have full contact. Having thoroughly investigated in accord with all that I've heard, day and night through the 4 reasonings, my moment of reflection on these topics of contemplation, may this discernment